Szymanski. He's a professor of sport management at the University of Michigan School of Kinesiology. He has a PhD in economics from Birkbeck College, University of London. As a leading expert in the economics of sports in general and soccer in particular, he's widely quoted in the media and has written op-eds for the New York Times, Washington Post, and Financial Times. He's also authored more than 100 academic articles and several books. And his talk today will be Soccer Analytics, Science, or Alchemy.
Thank you very much. And yeah, let me start out by just saying what a wonderful event this is, and congratulations to the organizers on really something. I love this kind of event. Someone was talking to me about this at the breakfast table and saying how, you know, not naming names, but there are these big conferences you can go to where what you hear from are the marketing executives telling you how great they are. And here, this is just more practical, talking about actually what you can do in practice and giving examples. And I just find that, certainly from my perspective, I'm much more interested in hearing this kind of thing than marketing talks on the whole. So let me, with that, kick off and talk about my background. What I want to do first is just say, I want to talk a little bit about how my own personal take on sports analytics. So firstly, I'm an economist, right? So it's a sort of adjacent, I suppose, field. And I'm probably best known as co-author of Soccernomics, which was first published in 2009, and which we were very much trying to get in on the data revolution in sports when that happened, right? That was very much our interest in doing that. And you know, as time went on, we've been through 5 editions now of the book, and we had added an extra chapter on data analytics in 2012, and then in 2020, I wrote this. So 5 years ago, I wrote this sort of slightly questioning paper, Sports Analytics, Science, or Alchemy, for Kinesiology Review. And in the last edition of Soccernomics that came out in 2022, we had a whole chapter about this issue. We completely rewrote the old chapter, looking at it, thinking about what data analytics is doing and what it isn't doing. And that's really what I want to focus on today. And you know, to be clear, you know, I'm a data analyst. I've been doing data analysts so longer than most of you have been alive. Let's face it. You know, I first started looking at soccer data in about 1989. So I've been doing this a long time, and I've added my own minor contribution. I organized this sports analytics specialization on Coursera. Again, one of the things, just using illustrations of how you can do sports analytics with publicly available data. And again, part of it is the attraction to me was this is free. You don't have to pay. You can pay if you want, but you don't have to pay for this. You can get all of this for free. And clearly, you know, we talk about an analytics revolution. This revolution is still going on, I would say, and it's a continuing process. And you know, I'm sure many of you are familiar with these kind of sites. I will say, compared to writing this 5 years ago, the examples I'm using here, all the backdrops are black. They've suddenly all become black, which suggests maybe some anxiety going on here about what's going on. But anyway, but you know, these are the sorts of, you know, Soccertake or Opta or Huddle. You know, you've got all of these different sources are coming on. And there's, of course, a tremendous amount of research going on. There's published research that go online on the internet, and you can just download lots and lots of papers doing analytics. So there's an awful lot of work going on, and a lot of it is really, really interesting. So let me say what I think is really exciting about this revolution. So the first thing is data availability. It's just this availability of large data sets in lots of formats, which is something that did not used to exist. Again, if someone like me who goes back to the Middle Ages, you just couldn't get this kind of data in the past. So the opportunities for doing research have just mushroomed beyond anything I would have imagined 30 years ago. The other thing is the accessibility of the technology to analyze the data. So again, part of like a lot of people like me, I still use Stata. It's a very good package. It works very well, but it's costly. I can't imagine teenage kids interested in coding paying this kind of money to get access to what is a really, really good program, don't get me wrong. But the availability of Python are online for free, open access, that's made a huge change. And I teach an analytics course at Michigan, and I'm just impressed by the number of students who come in who have already experience in coding in Python, which they did at high school, which was not something you could do in the past. And so there's this huge expansion of access. And there's vast numbers of people who previously couldn't have done it even if they wanted to, now have the ability to do it. So there's the availability of the data, and then there's the tools to analyze the data, which is just, these are just huge game changers. I just, again, I know some of you, many of you are experienced and know what you're doing anyway, but some of you, I know there are students here who are thinking about this, who are looking about it. And again, as an academic, I don't work in the field directly. I'm not an employee of a company. I've never been an analyst for a club or anything like that. So I don't know directly what that's like, but I do know from what people tell me, what I hear people say about the experience, and these sort of four kind of key elements of being a successful analyst in sports seem to me to be apposite. You have to know how to code, you have to know statistical methods, and you have to know your sport. But the most important point that I come across and hearing from people who actually do this for a living is they say, you have to have opinions, and you have to show us that you have opinions. You have to go out there, write stuff, and throw it out there. Start talking about what you think about sports analytics or what kind of insights you've got. And that, I think, is just great advice. Just open discussion is what we need to progress sports analytics and to make it and to improve it and advance it in the world. So again, I want to say, hopefully I've conveyed to you I'm a believer, I'm an optimist. I'm not here to say that this is all crazy and nonsensical. But I'm also, I'm old enough to have been an optimist about the internet when the internet began. So when the internet got going in the 90s, I remember thinking, wow, this is just fabulous. We're now going to be able to exchange opinions globally, and we will learn, and we will become better informed, and we're going to make so much better decisions in the future. How's that going? So I hope you understand I'm going to raise a note of caution in the context of saying we need data and we need data analysis, but we need to be a little bit, shall we say, discriminating in the positive sense of being choosy about what we believe in our approach to data. So I want to give you an example. So this is a Toy Town example that I'm going to give you based on something that I've always been interested in, which is explaining who wins the game. So it's a very simple example. Who's going to win? Who's going to win the games? And use the English Premier League as example. Again, partly because I'm English and I grew up with this, and partly because I was just, again, like I was saying, sitting at breakfast. Pretty much everyone around the table had a Premier League club that they followed. So this has become a kind of global currency. So it's easy to talk about. Most people will know what we're talking about. So as an economist, I would start with a theory. So, and again, it's a very simple theory. The outcome of a sporting competition is going to depend on the resources available to each side in the competition. This is not unique to sports. It's true to political conflict, armed conflict, any kind of contest situation, any kind of zero-sum game where there's a winner, and by definition, if you're not the winner, then you're the loser, and then the outcome of that competition, that zero-sum game, is going to be based on the share of resources available to either side. The second part of the theory that I would have, though, is that in soccer, it's an incredibly competitive environment. From competitive in the sense that economists mean a competitive or perfectly competitive environment, in the sense that there are very many buyers and sellers in this market. There are hundreds of thousands of players. There are thousands, tens of thousands of clubs. And so there are many potential buyers and sellers out there in the market. And there is information. And that's the big difference between the labor market in sports and the labor market in almost anything else. So the labor market in, for example, CEOs of corporations, that's a very opaque labor market. Who knows what the CEO really does? You know, I know what the CEO tells me he or she does, but I'm not, you know, I didn't see it, I didn't witness it, I didn't have a lot of evidence to go on, I don't have a lot of opinions to evaluate. Sports is the great thing about sports, and one of the reasons people like me study sports is because we have that information, not just little bits of information, we have lots of it, not just from one person, but from vast numbers of people expressing opinions. So in that kind of environment where you have more or less what you would think of as complete information about the employee, then you can form an accurate picture of what their worth is in the marketplace, how much they are worth compared to somebody of higher ability, lower ability. In other words, you can approximate ability by how much you spend. What a player commands in the market is a proxy of their ability. How good a proxy? Well, let's use the data to decide. Let's let the data, let's model that using the valuation of the players. So if you're interested in this, my very simple Toy Town model is available on the website. You can download it for yourself and play it out. And if you can do better, send me the code, and I'm interested. I'm curious. And the model is based on the games played in the Premier League this season, and the valuation of the players is based on the website Transfermarkt, which again I guess probably everybody here is now familiar with. And the Transfermarkt valuations of the players at the beginning of the season, not during the season when they have proven how good they are, but before the season started, so that as a way to predict what the outcomes might be. And again, a very simple ordered logistic regression based on the ratio, the log of the ratio of the transfer market value of the home team squad to the visiting team squad. So essentially you get two things out of it. You get a home team advantage parameter, a coefficient, and you get a TM ratio coefficient. And those, based on those, you can fit the model for all games to come. And so what I did was I just fitted that for the games on the, you can see actually for the rest of the season, but you can also see just, I did it 2 weeks ago, so I did it for last weekend and for this weekend. Now, what's a benchmark? What's a reasonable benchmark for establishing whether this is a good model or not? That's something we're going to need. Well, clearly the outcomes of games can't be forecast with certainty. And indeed, that's just kind of core fundamental. If this wasn't the case, we wouldn't even be interested in the game. If we knew with certainty what the outcome was, if it was possible to know with certainty what the outcome of a given game was going to be, we would be much less likely to watch. So the fact that there is some irreducible uncertainty that surrounds a game, and we have to take that as given. But fortunately, we actually have a mechanism for separating the irreducible uncertainty from that which is predictable, because we have the bookmaker odds. The bookmaker odds represent the limit of what we can reasonably be expected to know, given that bookmakers make markets and the possible outcomes of the game, and their profit depends on accurately representing the probabilities. In principle, a bookmaker can balance their books by choosing the odds of the outcome of the game such that whatever the outcome, they make the same amount of profit. Interestingly, not all bookmakers do that, but if they don't do that, then they don't really deviate very far from those balanced book probabilities. That's just, so in that sense, that's how it's the irreducible uncertainty. If you tell me that you can, well, if you can tell me that you can write a better model that will predict the outcomes of the games, then certainly take my code and send me your results, and I will join you in the Bahamas and we will retire peacefully. But until that happens, we have to think that we have a limit on the uncertainty, on the predictability of games based on that which is systematic and that which is non-systematic. So the model I used was just as I said, for just the games this season in the EPL up until January the 20th. So that was a total of 219 games. And the model predicted the same outcome as the bookmakers in 84% of cases. So they're actually pretty similar. But what you can see is that the bookmakers did slightly better. They got it right 112 times, and my model got it right 108 times, so a difference of 4. So notice that there are many cases where the bookmakers got it wrong and the model got it right, just as there are quite a few cases where the model got it wrong and the bookmakers got it right. So give an example today. The model predicted Brighton was going to win. That's kind of bad. Okay, I accept it. Failure of the model. Now, the bookmakers actually did predict Forest would win, so actually won up to the bookmakers. But then it was 4th minute of extra time when I last looked. The Southampton-Ipswich game. I assume Southampton actually ended up winning that game. Good. Well, the bookmakers said that Ipswich were going to win that game. The model said it was going to be a win for Southampton. So, you know, win some, lose some. And that's the nature of this kind of modeling, that the model on average is pretty close to the bookmakers, not always the same, slightly worse. And that's what I expect of a good model. A good model should come as close as possible to the bookmaker benchmark, but it would be implausible to think that it's going to beat it. And why is the model doing well? Because it's based on a good theory. It's a solid theory that resources determine outcomes of zero-sum games. It's a solid belief that there is a competitive market for players. So it's based on a solid foundation, and therefore it produces a plausible result. Let's compare. So Opta, very, very fine organization with obviously many people in this room use Opta data, and their contribution has been enormous over the years. Here they have a model of bookmaker predictions, which this is an example of for last weekend. And how does their model work? Opta has a supercomputer model. I have no idea why you need a supercomputer. I have a bog standard laptop. My regression took 1 second to run. What on earth do you need a supercomputer for? Well, they say they need a computer because they've got to model the strength of the opponents and match outcome probabilities and simulating the fixtures for the season, and they're putting this and that and all this stuff. Their model's not doing any better than the bookmakers, and it's performing roughly in line with my model. There isn't much scope. There's a very little gap between my model and the bookmakers, so yeah, you could maybe have a cigarette paper in between the two, but really it's not going to be very much. And indeed, many times it's going to be a lot worse. And I'm not picking on Opta, they're not the only ones. Stats Insider. I don't know very much about Stats Insider. They have an English Premier League prediction process using 10,000 simulations for each match, and based on an array of elements, including team form, player injuries, home field advantage, and up to them in EPL news, along with other pertinent variables. I expect they need a supercomputer as well. But they're not beating the bookmakers either. They wouldn't be publishing it if they were beating the bookmakers anyway, right? So that's obvious. And they're not doing significantly better than my model. My model has one variable, a log ratio. That's one variable. These people are just overclaiming, dramatically overclaiming what they can do. And that's a problem. That's a problem when people say they can do things that they can't really back up with evidence, and they talk a big talk without actually going into details. These models are bad because they actually have very limited scope to improve over the simple model. We should know when we have a simple explanation, we should rely on the simple explanation, Occam's razor. We don't need complicated models if we have a simple model. But it's also pernicious because of the opaque methodologies they're proposing. They say they can do things, and they claim special insight, which they just actually can't really have. They don't have. And there's a more general problem with this. This is kind of, I guess, an example of sort of predictive AI. That's the current term for this sort of area. Actually, something like 219 games is just not enough to train the data. It's too small a data set, right? I mean, in the language of econometrics, this is overfitting, right? You can't actually do this with this many observations. And it's not as if you can really say, well, data from MLS is really going to help us understand what's happening in the English Premier League. That's very unlikely to add very much. So it's not that you can take data from other leagues either and necessarily apply them. So in this particular problem, these models are just not really well suited to the task they're being presented for, and the people who are presenting these models are overclaiming what they can do. And if you think, oh, well, no, maybe it is predictable, this is actually an opta table, which I think is love. This is this season. Who could have predicted this? This is the win probability of the Premier League, where the purple line is Manchester City. And, you know, up until late October, I think we'd all have agreed. I don't know if there's anyone in the room who says, no, I knew City were going to collapse in a terrible heap and it was all going to go to pieces. Then good on you. But I think that would have been an unusual prediction, certainly not one I've had, and that Liverpool would suddenly emerge then as having this dominant probability. And, you know, we've got a ways to go yet. This could still change, right? So this could change. So this is a kind of market where it's not just that there is a systematic and a non-systematic component. That's true in lots of areas. It's just that the non-systematic component is very big over an entire season. And, you know, I give you an interesting tidbit to think about. Because of the financial restrictions that are now placed on clubs in the Premier League, the profitability and sustainability rules, and the fact that some clubs, like Manchester City, like Everton, have been found in breach of these rules. Now there's an issue of some clubs want to sue on the grounds that had they spent less, they would have done better. Burnley is suing Everton because Everton finished, 5 points above Burnley in 2022. Burnley were relegated. Burnley says, well, if we spent what Everton, if Everton had spent within the rules, not the overspending, then they could have achieved a much, Everton would have been relegated and Burnley wouldn't. There's an interesting data analysis problem if ever you had one, right? Thinking about how can you separate out then the systematic from the non-systematic component in that story. Okay, so but there are huge challenges about applying complex theories in sports data, right? So it's observational data, it's not experimental data. You can't use the standard or control group and treatment group methods, or there are very few situations which actually fit directly to that possibility. There's actually a huge amount of literature in the last few years in econometrics, in the economics field, about how to deal with this kind of problem. And there's actually some very interesting advances in how to study it. But it's still an area which is in flux and in development. And this is a kind of a, this is not specific to sports analytics. This is a social science problem in general. It's the same thing. We have huge problems in identifying the effects of race and gender on outcomes, specifically because we don't have controlled experimental situations where we can test these questions. Not that there are not issues, and not that there are things that happen. It's just that they're very, very hard to measure. Okay, so it's a general problem. It's not specific to sports analytics. I don't advertise this. So this is. There's a guy called Scott Cunningham who does a lot of work on causal inference, who's very interesting, and he's teaching a course this year, this semester, and he recommended this book, and so I got it, and it's very good. The chapters on predictive analytics predictive AI are really worth reading if you've not seen this stuff. It's actually and again, I want to say it's not about saying all of this is a waste of time. It's about saying, how do we decide what's useful and what's not useful? How do we discriminate between the garbage and the relevant information that we're getting out? And that's the real challenge. There's clearly an awful amount of, a lot of information that's out there that is useful and can contribute. It's a question of how do we discriminate and how do we decide what's useful and not useful? And we're still in the process of development. This is still a work in progress. So what's this got to do with Alchemy? Well, I thought about this a few years ago, and it struck me, the parallels seem very striking to me. So Alchemy was a kind of a medieval theory, actually, really, about how the world was built. And there are various versions, but one associated with this guy Paracelsus, who lived in the Middle Ages. He thought that there were basically these three elements that were both physical and, if you like, spiritual, and that related. So sulfur, male soul; mercury, female spirit; salt, substance, body. And this was the theory about how the world was built. And based on this, they thought that from these elements, you could generate new substances. You could change from one substance to another by using the relationship that existed between these. And so that's what they were actually doing, was trying to find a way of turning a base metal like lead into gold. That was the objective. Now, alchemy in general parlance, alchemy has a bad name. We tend to talk fairly negatively about alchemy because it's non-scientific. However, historians of science have actually revised their views about this in the last 20, 30 years. And if you read what the historians of science say, well, actually, there was an awful lot of good in alchemy. The alchemists were committed to turning lead into gold, and in doing so, there was nothing they would not try. They would try absolutely everything. And in the process of trying, you actually discover a lot of interesting things. So a lot of applications that we still use today come from alchemists trying out combinations of substances, experiments in heat, light, and so forth that they were using. So it's a sort of a two-edged thing. And I always think the great example of this is Isaac Newton, who's often his Principia Mathematica is often thought as, in many ways, the foundation of modern science, or part of the foundation of modern science, so certainly the major step. And he was writing in the 17th century. But most of what he wrote was alchemy. Most of his writings, actually, and there's just vast amount of writings, which is now almost completely ignored because it's all garbage, was alchemy. So it seems to me that this is sort of where we are with sports analytics. Probably most of what we're doing is garbage, but something scientific might come out of it at some point. With alchemy, what happened was chemistry. Chemistry replaced alchemy. And what the key step was getting rid of Paracelsus's theory and moving to an atomic theory that generated predictions that can be tested against data. And that's, I think, the sort of step we need to see in sports analytics. Because I think what we see in today is lots of data, very little reliance on theories, it strikes me. And when the theories are advanced, they're often quite complex and arcane. But the other thing I want to point out is the tendency towards secrecy. Again, one thing I love about this gathering is people openly discussing their models and methods and hopefully making them available for other people to try out. Secrecy is the enemy of progress. The more the data is kept secret, the less the rest of us can test it and the less we can find out and figure out for ourselves. So my view is, we have three challenges here in sports analytics. I think we need to expand the use of theory. I think that's something that needs to happen. I think we have to have far more openness about models and particularly the replication issue, which is, is a general issue. It's not just specific here. I mean, it's been a problem in much of science. I mean, economics, my own field, has had a huge replication problem. Psychology, oof, don't even get me going on psychology. But the other thing I want to say is that I think the alchemists were driven by turning lead into gold, profit. My view is profit is a very poor basis for advancing knowledge. Because it promotes secrecy, it actually undermines the spread of knowledge. I don't know how we get away from this, but I think we need to move to a world where it isn't just about winning, but about understanding. I'm not sure how we're going to do that. But in the meantime, go check out my forecast. See how I do with the second half of the day. All right. Thank you very much.